The ship's corridor lights flickered, painting harsh shadows across Vexalia's translucent skin. Once, that skin had shimmered with the bioluminescent patterns of her people, beautiful, intricate constellations that told the story of her lineage. Now, malnourished and broken, her body barely glowed at all. 63 cycles. She had counted each one, marking them in her mind as the humans dragged her between ships, between buyers, between hells. The Ceridian people were rare enough to fetch enormous prices, their ability to heal and their natural luminescence making them exotic commodities in the underground markets of the frontier sectors. Vexalia flinched as the door to her containment cell hissed open. She pressed herself against the far wall, violet eyes wide with terror. They weren't scheduled to feed her today. Unscheduled visits meant only one thing: someone wanted to sample the merchandise. "Please," she whispered, her translator implant converting her native clicks and trills into standard human speech. "No more today." But the figure that stepped through the doorway wasn't one of her usual tormentors. Taller than most humans, with dark hair pulled back tightly and a face weathered by both time and hardship, he wore the uniform of the ship's security, but something about his stance seemed wrong. His eyes found hers in the dim light, and where she expected to see the usual mix of cruelty, lust, or cold indifference, she saw instead a flash of shock, followed quickly by a burning rage that made her shrink further into the corner. "My God," he breathed, his voice barely audible. "What have they done to you?" He stepped forward, and Vexalia whimpered, raising her hands defensively. The movement caused the suppression cuffs around her wrists to send a warning shock through her system, not enough to incapacitate, but enough to remind her of her place. The man froze, then slowly crouched to her level, keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, each word measured and careful. "My name is Marcus Hawthorne. I'm here to—" "I didn't know they had someone like you aboard." Vexalia had learned not to believe the words of humans, especially kind ones. Kindness was always the prelude to deeper betrayal. Marcus glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. "Listen, I'm not supposed to be here. I infiltrated this ship to gather evidence on the Black Star Syndicate, but this—" he gestured at her cell, at the restraints. "This changes everything." He reached for his belt, pulling out a small device and approaching the control panel for her containment field. Vexalia tensed, expecting some new torment, but instead heard the soft beep of the security system disengaging. "We have about 10 minutes before they realize something's wrong," Marcus said, approaching her cautiously. "I have a ship docked for extraction. I can get you out, but we need to move now." Vexalia stared at him, uncomprehending. "Why?" she asked. It was the only question that mattered. Marcus's expression hardened. "Because I've spent 5 years hunting down people like the ones who hurt you, because no sentient being deserves this." He paused, then added more softly, "Because someone has to." A distant alarm began to sound. Marcus cursed under his breath, then extended his hand toward her. "Choose now, stay, or come with me." Vexalia looked at his hand, then at his eyes. She had nothing left to lose. With trembling fingers, she reached out and placed her hand in his. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Marcus moved with military precision, disabling her cuffs with practiced movements. He wrapped her in a thermal blanket from his pack and half-carried her through the ship's service passages, avoiding the main corridors. Twice they encountered guards. Twice Marcus dispatched them with brutal efficiency, using a stunner instead of lethal force. "No witnesses," he explained grimly as they ran. "No one to report what they saw." By the time they reached the docking bay, alarms were blaring throughout the ship. Marcus helped Vexalia into a small, unmarked vessel and strapped her into the co-pilot's seat. "Hold on," he warned as he fired up the engines. "This is going to get rough." As they broke away from the Syndicate ship, the first shots from its defense cannons streaked past them. Marcus's hands flew over the controls, the small ship weaving through the barrage with impossible agility. Vexalia watched his face, intense, focused, alive with purpose. She didn't understand this human, couldn't fathom why he would risk his life for a creature he didn't know. But as the stars blurred into streaks of light around them, one small spark ignited in the darkness of her spirit, the first fragile ember of something she had thought long extinguished. Hope. The moons of Valoran were known for their isolation. Tucked away in a system few bothered to chart, their barren surfaces held little value to miners or colonists. This made them perfect for someone who needed to disappear. Marcus's outpost was built into the side of a crater wall, its exterior camouflaged to blend with the dusty gray landscape. Inside, however, was a different world entirely. A surprisingly spacious haven filled with salvaged comforts and practical necessities acquired over years of solitary existence. Vexalia had been unconscious for most of their journey here. The trauma of her rescue, combined with years of malnutrition and abuse, had finally overwhelmed her fragile system. She awoke in a softly lit room, lying on an actual bed, the first she had felt in years. Her immediate reaction was panic. Unfamiliar surroundings meant new owners, new torments. She scrambled backward, her breathing rapid and shallow until her back hit the wall. That's when she realized something was different. The suppression cuffs were gone. Her skin flickered weakly with light, responding to her fear. "You're safe," came a voice from the doorway. Marcus stood there, keeping his distance, a tray in his hands. "This is my home. No one knows we're here." Vexalia eyed him warily. "Why did you bring me here?" "You needed medical attention I couldn't provide on the ship." He nodded toward the tray. "You also need to eat. Real food, not the synthetic garbage they were feeding you." The smell from the tray reached her, and despite her suspicion, Vexalia's body responded. A painful contraction of her stomach, a flood of saliva. How long had it been since she'd eaten anything that wasn't processed nutrient paste? Marcus approached slowly and set the tray on the bedside table. "It's not fancy, but it's better than rations. Protein, carbohydrates, vitamins, everything your body's been missing." He backed away again, giving her space. "I'm not going to hurt you, Vexalia. I'm not going to touch you unless you ask for help. This room is yours for as long as you need it." She stared at him, searching for the lie, for the hidden agenda. "What do you want from me?" The question came out hollow, practiced. It was always the first thing she needed to know with a new owner, what would be demanded of her. Marcus's face darkened. "Nothing. I want nothing from you except for you to heal." He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly tired. "Look, I've been fighting the Black Star Syndicate for years. Taking you was impulsive, but I couldn't leave you there." "You could sell me," she said flatly. "I'm worth more than this outpost." "I'm not a slaver," he replied, an edge in his voice. "I hunt them." Days passed into weeks. Vexalia remained guarded, expecting at any moment for the kindness to end, for the real purpose of her rescue to reveal itself. She stayed mostly in her room, emerging only when necessary, speaking little. Marcus kept his distance as promised, but his presence was constant. He left food for her, medical supplies, clean clothing. He installed a lock on her door that only she could control. He showed her the communication system, proving she could send messages off-world if she chose. "Though I wouldn't recommend contacting Ceridian space yet," he warned. "The Syndicate monitors those channels. They'd find you before your people could respond." One night, plagued by nightmares, Vexalia ventured into the common area to find Marcus working on equipment modifications. He glanced up but didn't comment on her presence, allowing her to observe from a distance. "You were military," she said finally, noticing the precision of his movements, the discipline in his posture. Marcus nodded. "Frontier Corps Special Operations." "Why do you hunt slavers now?" His hands stilled. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "My younger sister disappeared on a colony transport 15 years ago. By the time I found her trail, it was too late." He resumed his work, but his movements were more deliberate now. "The officials wouldn't help, said she was just another statistic, so I left the Corps and started hunting on my own." The raw pain in his voice resonated with something broken inside Vexalia. Without conscious thought, she moved closer, sitting across from him at the workbench. "My family thinks I'm dead," she said quietly. "It's better that way." Marcus looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Why?" "Because among my people, to be touched by outsiders is to be defiled, damaged." Her skin dimmed further as she spoke. "I could never return to them as I am now." "That's not fair," Marcus said, anger flashing in his eyes. "None of this was your choice." "Fairness has nothing to do with it," Vexalia replied, the bitterness in her voice surprising even her. "It simply is." That night marked a shift. Slowly, cautiously, Vexalia began to emerge from her isolation. She started helping around the outpost, first with small tasks, then gradually taking on more responsibilities. Her strength returned incrementally, and with it, a faint luminescence began to reappear across her skin, not the vibrant patterns of her past, but something tentative and new. One morning, as Marcus showed her how to maintain the outpost's water recycling system, their hands brushed accidentally. Vexalia flinched instinctively, but didn't pull away as she once would have. Instead, she found herself studying his hand next to hers, 5 fingers instead of 7, skin opaque and weathered instead of translucent and smooth, yet somehow not repulsive as she had been conditioned to believe. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, withdrawing slightly. "No," Vexalia replied, surprising herself. "It's all right." She looked up at him, at this human who had shown her nothing but patience and respect for weeks, and felt something unfamiliar stir within her chest, not fear, not suspicion, but something almost forgotten. Trust. 2 months had passed since the rescue. The outpost that had once felt like another prison to Vexalia now resembled something closer to a home. Her body had healed remarkably. Ceridians were resilient by nature, their cellular regeneration far surpassing that of humans. Her mind, however, still carried wounds that no biological function could mend. Yet even these were slowly changing. The nightmares came less frequently. The instinctive flinch at sudden movements had diminished, and the luminescence of her skin had strengthened, particularly along her arms and face, where faint, intricate patterns were beginning to reform. "They're beautiful," Marcus said one evening as they shared a meal. He gestured toward the silvery blue markings that traced her forearms. "What do they mean?" Vexalia hesitated, unused to discussing her people's ways with an outsider. But Marcus had earned her trust bit by painful bit. "They tell my story," she explained, extending her arms slightly. "This spiral pattern indicates my birth constellation. These branching lines show my family lineage." She traced a finger over a section that glowed more faintly than the rest. "These would normally show my life achievements, my place within our society, but they're incomplete now." Marcus studied the patterns with genuine interest. "Can they be restored?" "Some," she said softly, "with time and healing, others are lost forever." She looked up at him, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. "What about human markings? Some of your people have them on their skin." Marcus smiled. "Tattoos, they're artificial ink inserted beneath the skin. Mine is here." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a simple geometric design on his upper arm. "My sister and I got matching ones when I graduated from the academy." Without thinking, Vexalia reached out, her fingertips hovering just above his skin. "May I?" Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, surprise perhaps, or something deeper. "Of course." Her touch was feather-light as she traced the pattern. Where their skin met, her fingertips glowed slightly brighter, an involuntary response. She withdrew quickly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said. "That happens sometimes when Ceridians experience strong emotions." Marcus's expression was unreadable. What emotion caused that? Vexalia looked away. "Connection," she admitted. "It's been a long time since I've felt safe enough to connect with anyone." The days that followed brought a new dimension to their coexistence. Marcus began teaching Vexalia about human culture beyond the brutal slice of it she had experienced: music, art, literature. In return, she shared stories of her homeworld, descriptions of the floating crystal cities where Ceridians lived, the harmonies they created with both voice and bioluminescence. "We communicate as much through light patterns as through sound," she explained, demonstrating by creating a rippling wave of light across her skin. "Subtle variations can convey complex ideas, emotions, even poetry." "So your people are essentially walking conversations," Marcus observed, fascinated. Vexalia laughed, a sound that startled them both, for neither had heard it before. "I suppose we are." The laughter lingered between them, warm and unexpected. Vexalia found herself studying Marcus's face, seeing not just a human, but this specific human. The lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his expression softened when he looked at her. That night, alone in her room, Vexalia confronted the feelings she had been avoiding. The traffickers had used her body, had made the very idea of physical intimacy a source of revulsion and fear. Yet when she thought of Marcus, of his hands that had never once reached for her without permission, of his eyes that saw her as a person rather than a possession, she felt something entirely different, something that both terrified and intrigued her. The next morning, a crisis forced these thoughts aside. Marcus collapsed while performing maintenance on the outpost's exterior shields, barely making it inside before losing consciousness. Vexalia found him on the floor of the airlock, his skin burning with fever. Radiation poisoning, he gasped when he briefly regained consciousness. Shield maintenance, exposed, med cabinet, second shelf. Vexalia moved with newfound purpose, finding the medications he indicated and administering them according to his labored instructions. For 3 days, she barely left his side, monitoring his vitals, changing cooling packs as his fever raged, forcing fluids when he was lucid enough to swallow. On the 4th day, when his fever still hadn't broken and his breathing had become increasingly labored, she made a decision. Among her people, the sharing of healing energy was sacred, intimate, reserved for family members or bonded pairs. It required a merging of energies that left both participants vulnerable, connected in ways that transcended physical touch. But Marcus was dying, and she could not let that happen. Placing her hands on either side of his face, Vexalia closed her eyes and activated her deepest bioluminescent pathways, the ones connected to her life force rather than mere communication. Light spilled from her palms, spreading across Marcus's skin, seeking out the damaged cells and accelerating their repair. The process was draining, painful even, as she channeled her own recently recovered strength into his failing body. Hours passed as she maintained the connection, her light gradually dimming as his color improved. When Marcus finally opened his eyes, Vexalia was slumped beside him, her luminescence barely visible, her breathing shallow with exhaustion. "What did you do?" he whispered, reaching for her hand. "What was necessary?" she replied, her voice faint. Marcus insisted she rest while he recovered his strength. Their roles reversed. He brought her food, checked on her, worried over her diminished glow. When she was strong enough to leave her bed, he was waiting with questions she knew would come. "You risked your life for me," he said without preamble. "Why?" Vexalia met his gaze steadily. "Because you risked yours for me, because you saw me as someone worth saving when no one else did." She paused, gathering courage. "Because I couldn't bear to lose you." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and exposed. Marcus moved closer, slowly enough that she could retreat if she wished. She didn't. "The healing," she continued, "it creates a bond. Among my people, it's significant." "What kind of bond?" "One that allows each person to sense the other's emotions, sometimes even thoughts depending on proximity. It fades with time for most, but while it lasts," she hesitated, "while it lasts, there are no secrets." Understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes. "You let me see all of you." "Yes." "And you saw all of me." "Yes," her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "I saw your pain, your rage at what was done to your sister, to me, to countless others. But I also saw your compassion, your determination to right those wrongs." She swallowed. "I saw how you feel about me." Marcus's expression softened. "And how exactly do I feel about you?" Vexalia's skin brightened slightly, patterns shifting in what Marcus had come to recognize as embarrassment. "You care for me, not as a victim to be saved or a curiosity to be studied, but as I am." "Yes," he admitted simply, "I do." Her hand found his, fingers intertwining. Where they touched, her skin glowed with a steady, pulsing light, no longer the involuntary flare of surprise, but a deliberate communication. "What does that mean?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the light. Vexalia smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that made his breath catch. "It means I care for you too, despite every reason not to trust, not to feel." She moved closer, her free hand coming to rest against his chest. "It means I choose this, I choose you." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. Marcus let her set the pace, responsive but restrained, until she deepened the contact herself, her body illuminating with patterns of desire and affection that needed no translation. That night, Vexalia learned that intimacy could heal as well as harm, that her body was her own to share, not something to be taken. That pleasure could exist without pain, trust without betrayal. As they moved together, her luminescence filled the room with swirling patterns of blue and silver, transforming the utilitarian space into something magical. Afterward, lying in Marcus's arms, Vexalia felt a profound sense of reclamation. Her captors had stolen her freedom, her dignity, years of her life, but they had failed to destroy her capacity for connection, for love. She was still tracing idle patterns of light across Marcus's chest when the proximity alarm shattered their peace. Marcus was on his feet before the second alarm tone faded, reaching for the display panel embedded in the wall. Perimeter breach, southeast quadrant, he reported, his voice shifting to a clipped, professional cadence Vexalia hadn't heard since their escape. Multiple heat signatures approaching from the ridge. How did they find us? Vexalia's skin dimmed instinctively, a protective response her people evolved to hide from predators. Unknown, but we're about to have company. Marcus pulled on his clothes with practiced efficiency, then moved to a storage compartment concealed behind a false panel. From it, he retrieved a compact pulse rifle and a smaller sidearm. We have maybe 15 minutes before they reach the main entrance. Vexalia felt the familiar cold grip of fear, but something else burned alongside it now, determination. What do we do? We need to reach the emergency shuttle bay on the north face, Marcus explained, checking the weapons. It's stocked with supplies, has its own power source, and can outrun anything the Syndicate would bring to a remote location like this. He tossed her a pack. Essentials only, we travel light. As Vexalia gathered her few possessions, Marcus activated the outpost's defense protocols. This will buy us time, but not much. The system will execute a data wipe and initiate a structural collapse once we're clear. They'll find nothing of value. A sense of loss washed over her as she looked around the space that had become her sanctuary, but she pushed it aside. Walls and possessions could be replaced. Their lives could not. I'm ready, she said, securing the pack. Marcus paused, studying her face. There's something else you should know if we get separated. We won't, she interrupted. If we do, he insisted, there's an emergency beacon in your pack. Activate it, find cover, wait, I will find you. The intensity in his eyes made her throat tighten. She nodded once, unable to speak. They moved swiftly through the outpost's maintenance tunnels, a maze designed specifically for scenarios like this. The proximity alerts continued to ping, tracking their pursuers' progress. 6 hostiles, heavily armed, methodically sweeping toward the main entrance. Blackstar Elite Squad, Marcus muttered. They don't usually deploy for recovery operations. Someone must really want you back. The thought sent ice through Vexalia's veins. Vermilion, she whispered, the name catching in her throat. The Syndicate's chief acquisitions specialist, he collected me personally, called me his prize specimen. Marcus's expression hardened, but before he could respond, a new alert sounded, sharper, more urgent. They've breached the outer door, faster than expected. He quickened their pace. This way. They reached a narrow passage that sloped upward, leading to the concealed shuttle bay. Marcus keyed in an access code, and the reinforced door slid open, revealing a small craft nestled in a natural cavern. Start the pre-flight sequence, he instructed, handing her a data chip. I'll seal the tunnel behind us. Vexalia hurried to the shuttle, her fingers moving over the controls with growing confidence. The weeks of Marcus teaching her human technology were paying off. The engines hummed to life as system after system came online. A muffled explosion echoed through the rock, followed by the sound of weapons fire. Marcus dove into the shuttle, sealing the hatch. They found the emergency protocols override, he explained, taking the pilot's seat. Resourceful bastards. The shuttle's thrusters engaged, propelling them out of the concealed hangar and into Valoran's dusty atmosphere. For a moment, Vexalia allowed herself to hope they'd escaped cleanly. Then 2 sleek pursuit crafts rose from behind the ridge. Hold on, Marcus warned, banking the shuttle hard to port. This is going to get interesting. What followed was a harrowing chase through Valoran's canyon systems, the larger pursuit ships struggling to match their shuttle's agility, but compensating with superior firepower. Marcus flew with the skill of someone who had done this before, many times, using the terrain to their advantage. We can't outrun them forever, Vexalia observed as a blast struck their lateral shields, causing the cabin to shudder. We don't need forever, just long enough to reach the asteroid belt. Marcus nodded toward the navigation display, where a dense field of space debris orbited the system's outer planets. We can lose them there, make the jump to hyperlanes. And then what? Keep running? The question emerged before she could stop it. Marcus glanced at her, his expression softening momentarily. For now, until we find a more permanent solution. They weaved through narrow canyons, skimming close to rock walls that their pursuers couldn't risk. One of the Syndicate ships miscalculated, its wing clipping an outcropping. The resulting explosion bought them precious seconds, but the remaining ship was more cautious, more determined. As they broke atmosphere and accelerated toward the asteroid belt, the pursuing craft launched a targeting beacon that attached to their hull. "Damn it," Marcus hissed, checking the readouts. "They're tracking us now. We need to remove that before we can disappear." "Can we land somewhere? Detach it manually." Marcus shook his head. "No time, but there is an alternative." He input coordinates and the shuttle changed course slightly. "There's an abandoned mining facility in the belt. If we can reach it, we can use its defense systems to our advantage." The facility came into view, a collection of interconnected modules anchored to a large asteroid, dark except for minimal emergency lighting. Marcus transmitted an authentication code, and a docking bay opened reluctantly, its mechanisms clearly long unused. "You've been here before," Vexalia observed. "One of my emergency caches," he confirmed. "Not as comfortable as the outpost, but it has what we need." They docked with seconds to spare, the Syndicate ship closing rapidly. Marcus led Vexalia through the facility to a control room, where he activated ancient systems that groaned to life with surprising readiness. "Defense grid online," he announced. "Let's see how they like fighting blind." With a few commands, he activated a localized electromagnetic pulse. Their own systems, shielded within the facility, remained functioning. The pursuing ship, however, suddenly went dark, drifting helplessly. "That won't hold them long," Marcus warned. "They'll have backup systems. We need to move." But instead of returning to their shuttle, he led Vexalia deeper into the facility, to a hangar where another ship waited, sleeker, more powerful. "You keep ships hidden throughout the sector," she realized. "Preparation is survival." He began the startup sequence. "Their ship will be operational again in about 30 minutes. We'll be long gone by then." As they prepared to depart, Vexalia made a decision. "Teach me to defend myself," she said suddenly. Marcus looked up, surprised. "I'm tired of being helpless," she continued. "Of being someone who needs rescuing. If they find us again, when they find us again, I want to be able to fight." Something like pride flickered across Marcus's face. "It won't be easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is." She held his gaze, unflinching. "I won't be a victim anymore." They left the mining facility in their new ship, the tracker left behind on the disabled shuttle. For 2 weeks, they traveled unpredictable routes through the sector's less monitored regions, changing ships twice more at Marcus's hidden caches. During those weeks, true to his word, Marcus began training Vexalia. Combat techniques adapted to her physiology, weapons handling, strategy. Ceridians were not natural warriors. Their evolutionary advantages lay in healing and communication rather than fighting, but Vexalia proved a determined student. "Your natural agility is an asset," Marcus observed after a particularly grueling session. "And your bioluminescence can be weaponized, bright flashes to disorient opponents in close quarters." Vexalia nodded, absorbing the information. "My people have always been pacifists. We relied on diplomacy, on making ourselves valuable enough that others would protect us." "And how did that work out?" Marcus asked, his tone gentle despite the harsh question. "It failed us," she admitted. "When the Syndicate began taking our people, the Ceridian Council chose appeasement over confrontation. They gave up looking for those of us who were taken." Her voice hardened. "I won't make the same mistake." Their training sessions became a different kind of intimacy, a mutual trust expressed through shared knowledge, through the careful teaching of lethal skills tempered with restraint. At night, they found comfort in each other's arms, the bond between them deepening with each day. But peace could not last. 3 weeks after their escape from Valoran, as they docked at an isolated trading post to replenish supplies, they walked into an ambush. 6 Syndicate operatives, disguised as traders, opened fire the moment they recognized Vexalia. Marcus reacted instantly, pushing her behind a cargo container and returning fire with deadly precision. Vexalia, rather than freezing in terror as she once might have, drew her own weapon and positioned herself to cover their flank. The firefight was brief but intense. When it ended, 3 operatives lay dead, 2 had fled, and 1 remained barely conscious, pinned under Marcus's boot. "Who sent you?" Marcus demanded, his weapon pressed to the man's temple. "Who do you think?" The operative sneered, blood trickling from his mouth. "Vermilion wants his property back, says the Ceridian is too valuable to write off." His eyes shifted to Vexalia, narrowing with recognition. He's offering enough credits to buy a moon for whoever brings you in. Marcus increased the pressure of his boot. Tell Vermilion that the Ceridian has a name. Tell him Vexalia is under my protection. And tell him that the next time he sends someone after her, I won't leave anyone alive to carry a message back. They left the trading post immediately, but both knew what this meant. The syndicate was closing in, using its vast network to track them. Eventually, running would no longer be an option. That night, as their ship drifted in the shadow of a gas giant, they made a decision. "We can't keep doing this forever," Vexalia said, her fingers intertwined with Marcus's as they looked out at the stars. "Always one step ahead, always looking over our shoulders." "No," he agreed, "we can't." "So we stop running." She turned to face him, her skin pulsing with determination, with resolution. "We take the fight to them, to Vermilion." Marcus studied her face, seeing not the broken captive he'd rescued months ago, but a warrior who had reclaimed her strength, her dignity, her right to determine her own fate. "It would be dangerous," he cautioned. "Vermilion is well protected, surrounded by syndicate forces." "I know," her eyes held his, unwavering. "But I'm tired of being hunted, of living in fear. I want to be free, truly free, and that won't happen while he's out there, seeing me as something to be possessed." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we do this together. We fight, not just for survival, but for a future where we choose our own path." Vexalia leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his in a gesture that among her people signified absolute trust, absolute commitment. Where their skin touched, light bloomed, no longer the hesitant glow of a damaged soul, but the fierce radiance of one reborn. "Together," she agreed. And in that moment, surrounded by the void of space that had witnessed both her greatest suffering and her most profound healing, Vexalia made a silent promise to herself. The next time she faced her tormentors, it would not be as prey, but as predator. The plan was bold, perhaps reckless, but neither Vexalia nor Marcus could see another path forward. As long as Vermilion hunted them, they would never know peace. The time for running had ended. Now was the time to fight. Their target was Station Helios, a luxurious orbital platform in the Coraxis system that served as a playground for the wealthy and corrupt. Behind its gleaming facade of high-end boutiques and exclusive entertainment venues operated the Blackstar Syndicate's regional headquarters, where Vermilion oversaw all trafficking operations in the sector. "Security will be layered," Marcus explained as they studied the station schematics he'd acquired through his network of contacts. "Outer ring is mostly automated, scanners, drones, identification checkpoints. Middle ring has hired muscle, ex-military mostly, well-trained but not fanatics. Inner ring, where Vermilion operates, that's where the true believers are. His personal guards are syndicate lifers, augmented with military-grade implants." Vexalia absorbed the information, her mind creating and discarding strategies. The outer and middle rings can be penetrated with proper credentials and appearance. It's the inner ring that presents the greatest challenge. "Agreed, which is why we won't try to fight our way through it." Marcus highlighted a maintenance shaft on the schematic. "We'll bypass it entirely." The plan they developed over the next week was equal parts deception and precision. They would not attempt to assault Vermilion's fortress directly. That would be suicide. Instead, they would lure him out into a scenario of their choosing, where his advantages of manpower and territory would be neutralized. "The one thing we know about Vermilion," Marcus said, "is that he's obsessed with his collection, with you in particular. He won't delegate your recapture, he'll want to be there personally." "Then I'll need to be visible," Vexalia concluded. "Bait." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I don't like putting you at risk." "I'm not the same person they captured," she reminded him, her skin pulsing with confidence. "This is my choice." Their first move was to leak information through the shadowy networks that connected the sector's criminal enterprises, rumors that a Ceridian had been spotted on Station Helios, in the company of a human male. The trap was baited. Station Helios lived up to its name, a gleaming wheel of silver and gold rotating majestically against the blackness of space. Vexalia and Marcus approached in a luxury yacht they'd borrowed from a syndicate affiliate during a previous encounter, their identities disguised with top-grade holoprojectors. "Remember," Marcus said as they prepared to dock, "we only need to be seen enough to confirm the rumors. Then we disappear, lead them to the secondary location." Vexalia nodded, adjusting the settings on her holoprojector. To casual observers, she appeared as a humanoid female with elegantly styled dark hair and bronze skin. Only someone looking closely would notice the occasional shimmer beneath the projection, a glimpse of her true luminescent nature. They passed through the outer ring security with their forged credentials, then spent precisely 47 minutes in a high-end lounge in the middle ring, long enough to be noted by the establishment's surveillance, long enough for word to reach the right ears. Then, following the carefully mapped route they'd memorized, they slipped into the station's service corridors, disabled their holoprojectors, and vanished. "Contact made," Marcus confirmed, checking the specialized scanner he carried. "Two pursuit teams mobilizing, exactly as predicted." They moved swiftly through the maintenance tunnels, emerging in a lower security docking bay where they'd arranged for an inconspicuous transport to be waiting. By the time Vermilion's forces had organized a proper search, they were already departing Station Helios, their course set for the abandoned terraforming facility on Coraxis IV, the site they'd prepared for their confrontation. "Pursuit craft launching," Vexalia reported, monitoring the scanner. "3 ships, high-speed interceptors." Marcus smiled grimly. "Perfect." The chase that followed was calculated to appear desperate yet feasible, their ship maintaining just enough distance to make pursuit worthwhile, their flight path suggesting panic rather than strategy. When they reached Coraxis IV, skimming low over its partially terraformed surface toward the abandoned facility, their pursuers were exactly where they wanted them. The facility had once been the control center for an ambitious project to make Coraxis IV habitable. When funding had been cut, the massive complex had been left to decay, its cavernous chambers and labyrinthine corridors ideal for their purposes. Over the preceding week, they had transformed it into a battleground of their design, rigged with traps, surveillance, and strategic choke points. They landed in the central courtyard, hurrying inside as if seeking shelter. The pursuit craft landed moments later, disgorging armed syndicate operatives who moved with military precision toward the entrance. "First team taking the bait," Marcus confirmed, watching the surveillance feeds they'd established. 12 operatives, heavy weapons, no sign of Vermilion yet. "He'll wait until they secure the area," Vexalia said. "He's cautious that way." Sure enough, the second and third ships remained sealed, their occupants watching as the first team entered the facility. What followed was a careful dance of retreat and ambush, as Marcus and Vexalia led the team deeper into the complex, separating them, neutralizing them one by one through a series of prepared traps. "Second team deploying," Marcus noted an hour later. "They've lost contact with the first group." The second team moved more cautiously, but ultimately fell victim to the same strategy: divided, isolated, eliminated. Not killed, Marcus and Vexalia had agreed on that point. Their quarrel was with Vermilion, not with his foot soldiers. Incapacitated and restrained was sufficient. Finally, as the last member of the second team was subdued, the third ship's hatch opened. 6 elite guards emerged, forming a protective perimeter around a seventh figure. Vexalia's skin dimmed involuntarily at the sight of him. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit of charcoal gray, with features that might have been considered handsome if not for the cold calculation in his pale eyes. Vermilion, the man who had purchased her from her initial captors, who had personally overseen her processing into the syndicate's inventory, who had treated her pain and terror as merely inconvenient side effects of acquiring a valuable asset. "He's here," she whispered, her voice steady despite the memories threatening to overwhelm her. Marcus squeezed her hand once, reassurance, solidarity, right on schedule. Vermilion and his guards entered the facility, moving with the confidence of predators accustomed to being at the top of the food chain. Unlike the previous teams, they stayed tight, maintaining formation, covering all angles of approach. "Smart," Marcus observed, "but predictable." They watched as Vermilion's team methodically cleared room after room, discovering their incapacitated operatives, growing increasingly wary. Finally, the team reached the facility's central chamber, a vast space once used as the main environmental control center, now stripped of everything but a few essential components, and the trap Marcus and Vexalia had prepared. "Vermilion," Marcus's voice echoed through the facility's reactivated communication system. "Welcome to our humble abode." The syndicate leader didn't flinch, though his guards tightened formation around him, weapons raised. "The infamous Marcus Hawthorne, I presume?" You've caused me considerable inconvenience." "That was the idea," Marcus replied, "though I believe you and Vexalia have some unfinished business that takes priority." At the mention of her name, Vermilion's composed facade cracked slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle tension in his shoulders. "My property has a designation, not a name." "I am not your property," Vexalia's voice joined Marcus's over the communication system. "I never was." Vermilion smiled thinly. "A regrettable misconception I'll be happy to correct once you're back in appropriate containment. Your value has only increased with time, my dear. The bidding for exclusive access to your genetic material has reached quite remarkable levels." "There will be no bidding," she replied coolly. "There will be no containment. Today, you answer for what you've done, to me, to others like me, to everyone your syndicate has trafficked and tortured and exploited." Vermilion sighed with theatrical patience. "Heroic speeches are tedious. If you surrender now, I might consider making your reconditioning relatively painless. Continue this foolishness, and I'll ensure you spend the rest of your considerably long lifespan regretting it." "Enough talk," Marcus cut in. "Let's finish this." With those words, the trap was sprung. The chamber's lighting failed suddenly, plunging the space into near-total darkness. In that same instant, specialized sonic emitters activated, broadcasting at frequencies calibrated to disrupt the neural implants of Vermilion's guards without affecting unaugmented individuals. The guards staggered, disoriented, and temporarily blinded in the darkness. Only Vermilion remained steady, activating his own augmented vision, expensive military-grade technology that allowed him to see clearly despite the darkness. What he saw made him hesitate for the first time. Vexalia stood in the center of the chamber, her skin glowing with intense, shifting patterns of light. Not the subdued illumination he remembered, but a brilliant, aggressive display that momentarily overwhelmed even his enhanced vision. In that crucial moment of disorientation, Marcus struck from behind, disabling two guards with precise blows. Vexalia moved simultaneously, her movements fluid and confident as she engaged a third guard, using his superior strength against him just as Marcus had taught her. Vermilion recovered quickly, drawing a concealed weapon and targeting Marcus. "Enough of this farce," he snarled. Before he could fire, Vexalia released a blinding pulse of light directly into his augmented vision. The syndicate leader cried out, temporarily blinded, his shot going wide. She closed the distance between them with astonishing speed, executing a disarming technique that sent his weapon skittering across the floor. "You dare," Vermilion hissed, drawing a vibroblade from his sleeve. "I'll have you skinned for this." The fight that followed was vicious and personal. Vermilion proved himself more than a mere administrator. He moved with the ruthless efficiency of someone well-versed in violence. His blade slashed dangerously close to Vexalia's face, drawing a thin line of luminescent blood across her cheek. But Vexalia was no longer the helpless victim he had known. She countered his attacks with growing confidence, using her natural agility and Marcus's training to stay just beyond his reach, waiting for the opening she needed. Across the chamber, Marcus dispatched the remaining guards with methodical precision, never taking his eyes off Vexalia's confrontation. He wanted to intervene to protect her, but he understood what this moment meant. This was her battle to fight, her demon to conquer. Vermilion lunged forward, his blade aimed at Vexalia's midsection, a killing strike. She twisted away, but not quite fast enough. The blade sliced across her ribs, drawing more of her glowing blood. Pain flared, but she refused to yield to it. "Still so fragile," Vermilion taunted. "Still so easily broken." "No," Vexalia replied, her voice steady despite the pain. "Not anymore." With a surge of effort, she executed the counter-strike Marcus had drilled into her countless times, a feint followed by a precise blow to Vermilion's weapon arm. The vibroblade clattered to the floor. Before he could recover, she swept his legs from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. In an instant, she was above him, pinning him, her own recovered blade pressed against his throat. Her skin blazed with light, not just the patterns of her people, but something new, something fierce. "Do it," Vermilion challenged, his voice still composed despite his position. "Kill me, become what you claim to despise." Vexalia pressed the blade slightly harder, drawing a thin line of crimson. For a heartbeat, she was tempted to end the man who had caused so much suffering, who had taken so much from her. "No," she said finally. Death would be too easy. You don't get to escape what you've done. She looked up at Marcus, who had approached silently. We have what we need. He held up a data chip. Everything. Financial records, client lists, safe house locations, blackmail material on every official the syndicate has corrupted. Enough to dismantle Blackstar's operations in this sector permanently. Vermilion's composure finally cracked, his eyes widening with genuine alarm. You can't. The syndicate's reach is about to be significantly shortened, Marcus interrupted. The data is already being transmitted to every law enforcement agency in the sector, along with several influential journalists. Your empire is falling as we speak. Vexalia stood, stepping away from Vermilion but keeping her blade ready. You took everything from me, she said quietly. My freedom, my dignity, my connection to my people. You made me believe I was nothing more than merchandise. She looked at Marcus, then back at Vermilion. But in doing so, you gave me something you never intended, the strength to destroy you. The aftermath unfolded with surprising speed. True to Marcus's word, the data they had extracted during their infiltration of Station Helios proved devastating to the Blackstar Syndicate's operations. Within weeks, coordinated raids had shut down trafficking operations across 3 systems. Vermilion and his highest-ranking lieutenants faced prosecution on multiple worlds, their carefully constructed protection network collapsing under the weight of public outrage and political necessity. For Vexalia and Marcus, victory brought both closure and new beginnings. With the immediate threat neutralized, they had choices to make, choices about what came next, about who they would be now that survival was no longer their only focus. I've been thinking about the future, Marcus said one evening as they sat on the observation deck of their new ship, legitimately acquired this time with funds from accounts seized from the syndicate. Beyond the viewport, stars stretched to infinity. What about it? Vexalia asked, her skin glowing with soft, contented patterns. There are others out there, he said. More victims of trafficking, more organizations like Blackstar. My work isn't finished. Our work, she corrected gently. Marcus smiled. You don't have to, you're free now. You could go anywhere, do anything. Vexalia considered this. During their campaign against Vermilion, she had reached out to her people through secure channels, explaining her situation. The response had been unexpected, not rejection as she had feared, but an outpouring of support, offers to welcome her home, to help her heal further. I could, she agreed, but freedom means choice, doesn't it? And I choose this, I choose us. Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining. Besides, who better to help those still trapped than someone who knows exactly what they're experiencing? Marcus's expression softened. It won't be easy, there will be risks. There always are, she replied, but now we face them together. As if to emphasize her point, Vexalia's skin brightened, the patterns shifting to form a complex, beautiful symmetry that Marcus had come to recognize as an expression of love in the Ceridian visual language. His hand tightened around hers, no words needed between them. Their ship accelerated, leaving the Coraxis system behind. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenge, danger, but also purpose, hope, and a bond forged in the crucible of shared struggle and triumph. For Vexalia, who had once known only the darkness of captivity, this new path was illuminated by her own inner light, a light that could never again be dimmed by those who sought to possess her. And for Marcus, who had spent years consumed by vengeance, there was at last the possibility of building something rather than merely destroying. Together they faced the stars, no longer hunter and hunted, victim and savior, but equals, partners in a journey without end, finding in each other the home neither had believed possible.